In the quiet suburban streets of Millbrook Heights, Massachusetts, a 45-year-old man in a wheelchair was about to teach a vicious street gang a lesson they'd never forget. Mike Anderson seemed like any other disabled resident until the day the Street Kings made the fatal mistake of harassing him outside Morning Star coffee shop. What the notorious gang didn't know was that this seemingly vulnerable man in a wheelchair was one of Special Forces' most decorated operatives, with over 100 successful high-risk missions behind enemy lines. When their intimidation crossed a line, Mike made one phone call that would change everything. The Street Kings, led by the ruthless Razor Thompson, thought they were dealing with an easy target. Instead, they found themselves face to face with over 30 elite former Special Forces operators, men who had fought alongside Mike in some of the world's most dangerous combat zones. What began as a day of bullying and harassment ended in an extraordinary transformation that would reshape the future of Millbrook Heights forever. Before we continue with the story, if you like tales of justice and redemption, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story coming your way. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook Heights' tree-lined streets when Mike Anderson began his daily routine. His muscular arms, still powerful despite his disability, smoothly propelled his wheelchair along the familiar path to Morning Star coffee shop. The same route he'd taken every morning for the past 3 years, since returning home from his final mission, the one that put him in this chair but couldn't break his spirit. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," called Dave Miller, the coffee shop owner, his smile genuine and welcoming. "The usual today?" "Just a large black coffee, Dave," Mike replied, skillfully maneuvering his wheelchair through the entrance. His movements were precise, economical, the same efficiency that had kept him alive during countless covert operations now applied to navigating daily life. The familiar aroma of freshly ground coffee and warm pastries filled the air as he positioned himself at his regular table, the one with clear sightlines to all entrances and exits. Old habits died hard. The morning crowd was typical, commuters grabbing their drinks, locals lingering over breakfast, the usual rhythm of small-town life. That peaceful rhythm shattered with the rumble of approaching motorcycles. The sound grew louder, more menacing, until the roar of engines filled the quiet street. 5 bikes, then 10, then 15 pulled up outside Morning Star coffee shop, their chrome gleaming under the morning sun. The Street Kings had arrived. Mike's hands remained steady on his coffee cup as he watched their reflection in the shop's window. His military training kicked in automatically. Assess the threat, maintain awareness, stay calm. The leader, a man they called Razor, dismounted his bike with practiced arrogance. His leather jacket bore patches that spoke of violence and intimidation, his eyes cold as they fixed upon Mike through the window. "Well, what do we have here?" Razor's voice carried across the now silent coffee shop, drawing nervous glances from other customers. "Looks like someone left their toy outside." Mike continued sipping his coffee, his expression neutral. He'd faced worse, much worse. The mountains of Afghanistan had taught him that real danger rarely announced itself so boldly. "Just enjoying my coffee," he replied evenly. "No need for any trouble." One of the gang members, a tall man with tribal tattoos snaking up his neck, sauntered closer. His eyes caught the glint of metal on Mike's jacket. "Hey Razor, check this out. Special, horse's pin. Wheelchair warrior here thinks he's some kind of tough guy." Razor's laughter was sharp and mocking. "Special Forces? What happened? Couldn't dodge a bullet fast enough?" The words struck something deep inside Mike, but his expression remained unchanged. They couldn't know about the classified operation that had put him in this chair, about the lives he'd saved that day, about the medals locked in a box in his study. "I served my country," he said simply, placing his coffee cup down with deliberate care. Razor stepped closer, his boots scraping against the tile floor. "Served your country? Let me tell you something about service, old man. The only service happening around here is you serving us your money. This is Street King's territory now. Dave Miller had disappeared into the back, his face pale as he reached for his phone. Mike knew he was probably calling the police, but he also knew they wouldn't arrive in time to matter. Besides, this wasn't their kind of fight. If you're enjoying this story of courage and justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next in this incredible tale of hidden strength and retribution. Mike's mind flashed back to a night in Kandahar when he'd led his team through a terrorist stronghold to rescue captured civilians. The same calm focus that had guided him then settled over him now. These street thugs had no idea what they were walking into. "You should move along," Mike suggested, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded elite soldiers through countless missions. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will." The gang members spread out, forming a loose circle around his table. Other customers pressed themselves against the walls, phones recording, faces showing a mix of fear and concern. Razor leaned in close, his breath hot against Mike's face. "No, old man, I don't think we will. See, you need to learn about respect, and we're just the teachers you need." Mike's heart rate didn't even flutter. He'd stared down actual terrorists, felt the heat of real explosions. These boys were playing at being dangerous. They were about to learn what real danger looked like. As Razor's hand reached for Mike's wheelchair, the disabled veteran allowed himself a small smile. In his pocket, his phone was already dialing. A number, one he hadn't needed to use since moving to Millbrook Heights. But as he looked into Razor's eyes, seeing the cruelty there, he knew it was time to remind these street thugs what real warriors looked like. The Street Kings had no idea what they'd just started, but they were about to learn a lesson about real strength, real courage, and real consequences. And it would begin with a single phone call to the men who'd fought beside him in the world's darkest places, men who owed him their lives and were about to repay that debt. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the coffee shop's worn tile floor. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Razor's fingers dug into the armrest of Mike's wheelchair. The Street Kings had formed a tight circle around them, their leather jackets creaking as they shifted, anticipating violence. Through the window, Mike could see Dave Miller in his office, frantically speaking into his phone. The other customers had retreated to the far corners of the shop, their faces a mixture of fear and concern. A young woman was crying softly, her breakfast forgotten on her table. "I said," Razor repeated, his voice dropping to a threatening growl, "you need to learn about respect, and lesson 1 starts now." Mike's mind traveled back to his training, days at Fort Bragg, where he'd learned that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation wasn't when the enemy was threatening you. It was when they thought they had you beaten. That's when they got careless. "Son," Mike's voice remained steady, the same tone he'd used to command special forces teams through hurricane-force winds and enemy fire. "I've faced things that would make your little gang run crying home to mama. Now I'm going to give you one last chance to walk away." One of the gang members, a younger man who couldn't have been more than 25, let out a harsh laugh. "Hey, Razor, wheelchair guy thinks he's giving us chances." Mike noted the kid's position, his stance, the way he favored his right side. Information catalogued automatically through years of combat training. Kyle Snake Peterson, according to the patch on his jacket. The newest member of the Street Kings, trying to prove himself. "Maybe we need to show him what chances look like in our territory," Snake suggested, pulling out a switchblade and flicking it open with practiced flair. If you're gripped by this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story will be just as intense, and you won't want to miss it. Mike's wheelchair was positioned exactly 3 feet from the nearest table, 7 feet from the door. His years of tactical planning had never really stopped. They'd just shifted to civilian applications. Every room he entered was automatically mapped escape routes and choke points identified, old habits that were about to become very relevant. "Your territory?" Mike asked, allowing a hint of amusement to color his voice. "Son, do you even know what real territory is? I've fought in places where the land itself tried to kill you, where every shadow held death, where the air you breathed could be your last." Something in his tone made Razor hesitate for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But his pride wouldn't let him back down, not in front of his gang. "Big words from a man who can't even stand up," Razor sneered. But there was a new edge to his voice, a hint of doubt. Mike's phone had connected during the exchange, the call going through silently. On the other end, James "Jim" Carter was already moving, decades of combat response kicking in at the sound of his former teammate's voice.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Listen carefully," Mike said, his words carrying the weight of countless missions, of life and death decisions made in fractions of seconds. "What you see is a man in a wheelchair. What you don't see is someone who's killed men twice as tough as you with nothing but his bare hands. What you don't see is someone who's led elite warriors through hell itself and brought them back alive." The coffee shop had fallen completely silent. Even the usual morning traffic outside seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "You think this wheelchair makes me vulnerable?" Mike continued, his eyes locked with Razor's. "This chair is a reminder of the price I paid keeping people safe from men who thought violence made them powerful. Men just like you." Snake took a step forward, his blade glinting in the morning light. "Enough talk. Let's show him what real power looks like." Mike's smile was slight, but carried decades of combat experience. "You boys really want to see what real power looks like? Keep pushing. You're about to learn the difference between thugs and warriors." Razor's hand shot out, grabbing Mike's shirt collar. "Last chance, old man. Empty your pockets, give us what we want, and maybe you roll out of here with just a few bruises." Through the window, Mike caught the first glimpse of movement, familiar faces appearing in strategic positions around the coffee shop. Jim Carter had made good time, and he hadn't come alone. "Funny," Mike replied, his voice carrying no hint of fear. "I was about to say the same thing to you. Last chance to walk away. Next lesson won't be taught with words." The Street Kings erupted in mocking laughter, but it died quickly as the coffee shop's door swung open. Colonel Robert "Bob" Hayes stepped in, his presence commanding immediate attention. Behind him, Sam Martinez and Chris Morgan took up positions by the windows, their movements carrying the unmistakable precision of military training. "Everything okay here, Mike?" Hayes asked, his voice casual but carrying an edge of steel. Razor spun around, his hand releasing Mike's collar. The Street Kings shifted nervously, suddenly aware that the dynamics of the situation had changed dramatically. "Just having a discussion about respect," Mike replied calmly. These young men seem to have some confused ideas about what that word means. More figures were appearing now. Kevin McDonald by the back door, Jim Carter and 3 other former operators taking positions around the street. The Street Kings found themselves surrounded by men who'd spent their lives perfecting the art of combat. "Respect," Hayes mused, stepping closer. "Interesting topic. Maybe we should share some of our experiences with these gentlemen, help them understand the difference between intimidation and true strength." The morning sun streaming through the windows caught the edges of Hayes' Special Forces ring, a silent reminder of the brotherhood that never truly ended, even years after leaving the service. "This isn't over," Razor snarled, but his voice had lost its certainty. "This is our territory, and you can't be here all the time." "That's where you're wrong, son," Hayes replied, his smile cold. "See, Mike here saved every man in this room, at least once. Some of us he saved multiple times, and we've been looking for a reason to move back to a nice, quiet town like Millbrook Heights. The Street Kings were about to learn that they hadn't just picked a fight with a man in a wheelchair. They'd awakened a brotherhood forged in combat, tempered by sacrifice, and bound by a code that went deeper than blood. The real story was just beginning, and Millbrook Heights would never be the same. The morning light filtered through Morning Star coffee shop's windows, casting long shadows across a scene frozen in tension. The Street Kings found themselves in an unfamiliar position, outnumbered by men whose quiet confidence spoke of real combat experience. Razor's face twisted with barely contained rage as he assessed the situation. "You think bringing in some old veterans changes anything?" He spat, but his eyes darted nervously between the former Special Forces operators now positioned strategically around the coffee shop. "This isn't the army, this is the street." "You're right about one thing," Mike replied calmly, adjusting his wheelchair slightly. "This isn't the army. We're not bound by military rules of engagement anymore. If you're finding this story of justice and brotherhood compelling, take a moment to subscribe. Tomorrow's story will be just as gripping, and you won't want to miss it." Colonel Hayes moved with deliberate precision, positioning himself where every Street King could see him clearly. His voice carried the authority of countless combat missions when he spoke. "Let me explain something to you boys," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "In the army, we had rules, regulations, chain of command. Out here," he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Out here we just have loyalty, brotherhood, and a very particular set of skills that make us extremely dangerous to young men who don't know any better." Snake, the young gang member with the switchblade, shifted uncomfortably. "We've got skills too, old man, and we've got numbers. Your little crew can't be everywhere." Jim Carter's laugh was sharp and knowing. "Numbers? Son, Mike here once led a 4-man team against an entire enemy compound. Want to guess how that turned out?" The other veterans had taken up positions that any military man would recognize. Interlocking fields of fire, covered approaches, tactical superiority. It wasn't random, it was muscle memory. Decades of training turning the coffee shop into a controlled battle space. "This is the only warning you're going to get," Mike said, his wheelchair positioned perfectly to give him clear sightlines to every gang member. "Millbrook Heights isn't your territory, it's our home, and we protect our home." Razor's face contorted with fury. "You think I'm scared of some crippled vet and his geriatric friends? This isn't over, not by a long shot." "Actually, Sam," Martinez spoke up from his position near the window, "it is over. You just don't know it yet." His fingers tapped meaningfully on his phone. "While we've been having this pleasant chat, every moment has been recorded, including the threats, the weapon display, and the attempted assault on a disabled veteran." Chris Morgan stepped forward, his former role as communications specialist evident in his precise delivery. "Those recordings are already uploaded to secure servers. One copy to the police, one to the FBI's gang task force, and one to a few friends. We have in military intelligence who take a very dim view of people threatening decorated Special Forces operators." The Street King's bravado was cracking. Even Razor, for all his bluster, could sense the shift in power dynamics. These weren't the usual victims they terrorized. These men radiated lethal capability, controlled violence held in check only by choice. "You're bluffing," Razor snarled, but his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Mike wheeled himself forward slightly, his movements smooth and controlled. "Remember what I said about the difference between thugs and warriors? Here's another lesson. Warriors don't bluff. We don't need to." Through the windows, more vehicles were arriving, not police cars, but civilian trucks and SUVs carrying more former operators. Kevin "Mac" McDonald's voice came clearly from his position by the door. Word travels fast in our community, especially when one of our own needs backup. Dave Miller, the coffee shop owner, had emerged from his office, his initial fear replaced by a sense of awe as he watched the scene unfold. Other customers were starting to relax, some even taking out their phones to record what was happening. "Last chance," Mike said quietly. "Walk away now, take your gang, leave Millbrook Heights, and we can pretend this morning never happened. Stay, and you'll learn exactly why Special Forces operators are considered the most dangerous men in the world. Chair or no chair." Razor's internal struggle was visible on his face, pride warring with self-preservation. His gang looked to him, waiting for a decision that would shape their future. "This isn't the end," he finally growled, signaling his men to back away. "You've just made things worse for everyone." "No," Mike corrected him. "I've just shown you what real strength looks like. Remember this moment. Remember that the guy in the wheelchair wasn't the easy target you thought he was. And remember that next time, we might not be in such a forgiving mood." The Street Kings backed out of the coffee shop, trying to maintain their intimidating facade, but failing miserably. Their motorcycles roared to life, the sound no longer menacing but somehow hollow, like the empty threats they'd made. As the gang disappeared down the street, Colonel Hayes turned to Mike. "They'll be back. Thugs like that can't handle being humiliated." "I'm counting on it," Mike replied, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Because next time, they won't just learn about respect, they'll learn about consequences." The coffee shop erupted in applause, tension releasing in a wave of relief and gratitude. Dave Miller approached Mike's table, coffee pot in hand. "This one's on the house," he said, refilling Mike's cup. "Actually, all your coffee's on the house from now on." But Mike's mind was already working, analyzing patterns and possibilities, planning for what would come next. He knew the Street Kings wouldn't take this humiliation lying down. They'd return, probably with reinforcements, definitely with a plan for revenge. What they didn't know was that this morning's encounter was just the beginning. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Out here we just have loyalty, brotherhood, and a very particular set of skills that make us extremely dangerous to young men who don't know any better. Snake, the young gang member with the switchblade, shifted uncomfortably. "We've got skills too, old man, and we've got numbers. Your little crew can't be everywhere." Jim Carter's laugh was sharp and knowing. "Numbers? Son, Mike here once led a 4-man team against an entire enemy compound. Want to guess how that turned out?" The other veterans had taken up positions that any military man would recognize. Interlocking fields of fire, covered approaches, tactical superiority. It wasn't random, it was muscle memory. Decades of training turning the coffee shop into a controlled battle space. "This is the only warning you're going to get," Mike said, his wheelchair positioned perfectly to give him clear sightlines to every gang member. "Millbrook Heights isn't your territory, it's our home, and we protect our home." Razor's face contorted with fury. "You think I'm scared of some crippled vet and his geriatric friends? This isn't over, not by a long shot." "Actually, Sam," Martinez spoke up from his position near the window, "it is over. You just don't know it yet." His fingers tapped meaningfully on his phone. "While we've been having this pleasant chat, every moment has been recorded, including the threats, the weapon display, and the attempted assault on a disabled veteran." Chris Morgan stepped forward, his former role as communications specialist evident in his precise delivery. "Those recordings are already uploaded to secure servers. One copy to the police, one to the FBI's gang task force, and one to a few friends. We have in military intelligence who take a very dim view of people threatening decorated Special Forces operators." The Street King's bravado was cracking. Even Razor, for all his bluster, could sense the shift in power dynamics. These weren't the usual victims they terrorized. These men radiated lethal capability, controlled violence held in check only by choice. "You're bluffing," Razor snarled, but his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Mike wheeled himself forward slightly, his movements smooth and controlled. Remember what I said about the difference between thugs and warriors? Here's another lesson. Warriors don't bluff. We don't need to. Through the windows, more vehicles were arriving, not police cars, but civilian trucks and SUVs carrying more former operators. Kevin Mac McDonald's voice came clearly from his position by the door. Word travels fast in our community, especially when one of our own needs backup. Dave Miller, the coffee shop owner, had emerged from his office, his initial fear replaced by a sense of awe as he watched the scene unfold. Other customers were starting to relax, some even taking out their phones to record what was happening. "Last chance," Mike said quietly. "Walk away now, take your gang, leave Millbrook Heights, and we can pretend this morning never happened. Stay, and you'll learn exactly why Special Forces operators are considered the most dangerous men in the world. Chair or no chair." Razor's internal struggle was visible on his face, pride warring with self-preservation. His gang looked to him, waiting for a decision that would shape their future. "This isn't the end," he finally growled, signaling his men to back away. "You've just made things worse for everyone." "No," Mike corrected him. "I've just shown you what real strength looks like. Remember this moment. Remember that the guy in the wheelchair wasn't the easy target you thought he was. And remember that next time, we might not be in such a forgiving mood." The Street Kings backed out of the coffee shop, trying to maintain their intimidating facade, but failing miserably. Their motorcycles roared to life, the sound no longer menacing but somehow hollow, like the empty threats they'd made. As the gang disappeared down the street, Colonel Hayes turned to Mike. "They'll be back. Thugs like that can't handle being humiliated." "I'm counting on it," Mike replied, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Because next time, they won't just learn about respect, they'll learn about consequences." The coffee shop erupted in applause, tension releasing in a wave of relief and gratitude. Dave Miller approached Mike's table, coffee pot in hand. "This one's on the house," he said, refilling Mike's cup. "Actually, all your coffee's on the house from now on." But Mike's mind was already working, analyzing patterns and possibilities, planning for what would come next. He knew the Street Kings wouldn't take this humiliation lying down. They'd return, probably with reinforcements, definitely with a plan for revenge. What they didn't know was that this morning's encounter was just the beginning. "They'll expect us to go to the police," he said finally. "They've probably got contingencies for that. What they won't expect is a coordinated response from trained operators who know how to fight asymmetrically." Colonel Hayes smiled grimly. "Just like old times, eh, Mike? Outnumbered, outgunned, but never outmaneuvered." "With one difference," Mike corrected him. "This time we're fighting for our home, not someone else's." The veterans gathered around the table as Mike began outlining his plan. Each man added his expertise, refining the strategy. They'd fought together in the world's harshest environments, faced overwhelming odds, and emerged victorious. Now they would use those same skills to protect their community. "First," Mike explained, "we need to understand their pattern of life. Chris set up surveillance on their key locations. I want to know their routines, their vulnerabilities." "Already on it," Chris replied. "I've got drone coverage scheduled and cameras being placed in strategic locations." "Mac, you still got those construction company contacts?" Kevin nodded. "Ready whenever you need them. We can have legitimate work crews on any street in town, perfect cover for surveillance and quick reaction teams." "Sarah," Mike turned to the physical therapist, "we need to expand those self-defense classes. Every potential victim they might target needs to become a hard target." "I can start additional classes tomorrow," she agreed. "And I know several other instructors who'd be willing to help." The morning sun had climbed higher, casting different shadows across the coffee shop floor. Dave Miller approached the table with fresh coffee and a determined look on his face. "Whatever you need," he said firmly. "Morningstar Coffee Shop is at your disposal. This can be your command center for as long as necessary." Mike looked at his brothers in arms, men who'd fought beside him in the world's darkest places. Now, they would fight again, not against foreign enemies, but against those who would destroy their community through fear and violence. "The Street Kings think they can take this town through intimidation," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had led men through countless battles. "They're about to learn what happens when they face men who've stared down real evil and didn't blink." Outside, Millbrook Heights continued its daily routine, unaware that a shadow war was about to begin. But this time, the shadows belonged to the warriors, not the thugs. And warriors knew how to use darkness to their advantage. "One more thing," Mike added, his expression serious. "We do this right, by the book. Every action documented, every move legal. We're not just fighting the Street Kings. We're fighting for the soul of this town, and we'll do it the right way." The veterans nodded in agreement. They'd fought enough wars to know that how you won was just as important as winning itself. The battle for Millbrook Heights was about to begin, and the Street Kings had no idea what kind of force they'd awakened. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Carter's fitness center as Mike Anderson watched Jim's staff clear out the last few regular clients. The gym, normally filled with the sounds of clanking weights and workout music, had transformed into something altogether different. Exercise equipment had been pushed aside to make room for what was essentially a military command post. Chris Morgan had set up a sophisticated communication center in Jim's office, multiple screens displaying surveillance feeds from around Millbrook Heights. The old warehouse district, where the Street Kings made their base, was visible from several angles. Sam Martinez was coordinating with his FBI contacts via encrypted channels, while Kevin Mac McDonald's construction crews had already begun positioning equipment at strategic locations throughout the town. "Latest intel," Chris reported, his fingers flying over his keyboard. "Street Kings are calling in reinforcements. 3 vehicles just arrived at their warehouse, out-of-state plates. Looks like Razor's not taking this morning's humiliation lightly." Mike wheeled himself closer to the monitors, his tactical mind analyzing every detail. "Those aren't just random reinforcements. Look at how they move. Organized, disciplined. These aren't street thugs." Colonel Hayes stepped forward, studying the footage. Professional mercenaries. Probably ex-military, but not the honorable kind, the type that'll sell their skills to the highest bidder. The gym's front door opened, and Sarah Wilson entered, followed by Emily Chen from the grocery store and several other business owners from downtown. They'd come to join what was quickly becoming a community resistance movement. "We've had enough," Emily declared, her voice firm despite her obvious nervousness. "The Street Kings threatened my 16-year-old daughter yesterday, said she should consider working for them. I won't let that stand." Mike's jaw tightened. In his mind, he was back in a different place, a different time, watching children being exploited by warlords. Some enemies never changed, they just wore different clothes. "They're targeting the most vulnerable first," he observed, his voice carrying years of tactical analysis. "Trying to establish control through fear, classic insurgency tactics. Then we counter it with classic counterinsurgency," Colonel Hayes responded. "Hearts and minds plus a heavy dose of superior force when needed." The gym's back door opened and more veterans began arriving. Not just Special Forces operators this time, but Marines, Rangers, SEALs. Word had spread through the veteran community, and warriors were answering the call. Each man and woman who entered carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of trained professionals. Marcus Johnson, 3rd Battalion, 75th Rangers, one of the newcomers, introduced himself. "Heard you could use some help cleaning up the neighborhood." Rachel Torres, Marine Force Recon, another stepped forward. "My sister owns the bakery on 5th Street. These thugs tried to shake her down last week." One by one, they introduced themselves, each bringing unique skills and experience to the fight. Mike recognized the look in their eyes, the same determination he'd seen in operators preparing for crucial missions. These weren't just veterans, they were warriors who'd found a new purpose. "Here's what we know," Mike began, addressing the growing assembly. "The Street Kings have evolved from a local gang into something more dangerous. They've got professional backup now, probably funded by whoever's supplying their weapons. But they've made a critical mistake. They think controlling territory is about fear." He wheeled himself to the center of the room, commanding attention without effort. "We know better. Real control, real security comes from the community itself. That's why we're not just going to fight the Street Kings, we're going to build something they can't break." Sarah stepped forward, spreading out a map of Millbrook Heights. "I've already got 15 volunteers for the expanded self-defense classes. Local parents are organizing neighborhood watch groups. People are tired of being afraid." "Good," Mike nodded, "because this isn't just about combat. It's about showing Millbrook Heights that they don't have to live in fear. Every person we train, every business we protect, every kid we keep out of the Street King's hands, that's how we win." Colonel Hayes began assigning roles, drawing on each person's strengths. Chris Morgan's surveillance team would monitor gang movements. Sam Martinez would coordinate with law enforcement. Kevin's construction crews would provide mobile cover for observation posts. The Rangers would handle perimeter security, while Force Recon set up quick reaction teams. Emily Chen and the other business owners would be their eyes and ears on the street, reporting suspicious activity through encrypted channels Chris had set up. Sarah's self-defense classes would become intelligence-gathering opportunities, identifying vulnerable areas and potential threats. "Remember," Mike emphasized, "we do this smart, we do this legal. Every action documented, every move justified. We're not vigilantes, we're community defenders. The Street Kings want to operate in the shadows? Fine, we'll shine a light so bright they'll have nowhere to hide." As if to punctuate his words, one of Chris's monitors lit up with activity. "Movement at the warehouse," he reported. "Looks like they're planning something for tonight." "Let them," Mike replied, a slight smile playing at his corners of his mouth. "Every move they make just tells us more about who they are and how they operate. By the time they realize their mistakes, it'll be too late." The assembled veterans moved with purpose, breaking into teams, establishing communications protocols, preparing for whatever the night might bring. They'd fought in deserts, jungles, and mountains across the world. Now they would fight for their own streets, their own homes. "One more thing," Mike added, as the teams prepared to deploy. "The Street Kings think they're going to war with a bunch of old veterans and one guy in a wheelchair. Let's show them what real warriors can do." Outside, the sun was setting over Millbrook Heights. In homes across town, families locked their doors, worried about what the night might bring. But they didn't know that tonight was different. Tonight, trained operators were taking up positions throughout their community. Tonight, the hunters would become the hunted. As Mike watched the surveillance feeds, his mind was already several moves ahead, analyzing patterns, predicting responses, planning countermoves. The wheelchair hadn't changed his strategic thinking. If anything, it had sharpened it. The Street Kings thought they'd picked an easy target. Instead, they'd awakened a force they couldn't possibly understand. The real battle for Millbrook Heights was about to begin, and it would be fought with the precision and expertise that only decades of Special Forces experience could bring. The Street Kings were about to learn the difference between thugs who threatened violence and warriors who had mastered it. Darkness had settled over Millbrook Heights like a tactical blanket, transforming familiar streets into an urban battle space. From his position in Carter's Fitness Center command post, Mike Anderson watched multiple surveillance feeds while coordinating with teams positioned throughout the town. The Street Kings were making their move, exactly as predicted. 3 vehicles. Heading east on Main Street, Chris Morgan reported, his eyes never leaving his monitors. 2 motorcycles running escort. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore. Mike's wheelchair was positioned for optimal views of both the screens and the gym's entrances. Years of combat experience had taught him never to let your guard down, even in supposedly secure locations. "They're sending a message," Colonel Hayes observed from his position near the communications setup. "Trying to show they're not afraid of us." "No," Mike corrected, noting the precision of the vehicle's movements. "They're trying to draw our attention. This is a feint. Chris, show me the warehouse district." The screen shifted, revealing increased activity around the Street King's main base. Professional-looking men in tactical gear were loading equipment into unmarked vans. Their movements were disciplined, coordinated, definitely ex-military. "Razor's new friends are busy," Sam Martinez commented, entering the command post with fresh intelligence. "My FBI contact says these guys are connected to a private military contractor with a questionable reputation. They specialize in territorial acquisition for criminal enterprises." Mike's mind raced through the implications. They're not just bringing in muscle, they're implementing a strategic takeover. The Street Kings are just the visible face. The real threat is whoever's backing them. The gym's back door opened as Sarah Wilson arrived with Emily Chen. Both women looked worried. "They're targeting the kids," Emily reported, her voice tight with concern, "offering them jobs after school, promising easy money. 3 more teenagers disappeared today." "They're building their next generation," Mike said grimly, "creating a pipeline of vulnerable recruits while establishing control over the community. Classic insurgency tactics." Through the windows, they could see Kevin Mac McDonald's construction crews strategically positioning equipment around town, providing cover for surveillance teams. The Street Kings wouldn't realize that every piece of machinery was carefully placed to create interlocking fields of observation. "Movement at St. Mary's Medical Center," Chris called out suddenly. 2 of their vehicles just pulled into the emergency parking lot. Mike wheeled closer to the screens, his expression darkening. "They're going after the prescription drug supply. Smart, establish multiple revenue streams while creating chemical dependencies in the community." Colonel Hayes was already mobilizing a response team when Mike held up his hand. "Wait, let's think this through. They're being too obvious, almost like they want us to respond." Jim Carter finished the thought, understanding dawning on his face. "They're testing our capabilities, trying to see how we react." Mike nodded, a slight smile playing at his lips. "And we're going to show them exactly what they expect to see. Chris, get me Marcus and his Rangers. Time to give them a show." Within minutes, Marcus Johnson's team was deploying to the hospital in an obvious response pattern, exactly what a group of concerned veterans might do. But while the Street Kings watched that performance, Rachel Torres and her Force Recon team were quietly moving into position around the warehouse district. "Sometimes," Mike explained to the gathered observers, "the best way to hide your real capabilities is to give the enemy what they think they're looking for." Sarah approached Mike's position, her medical training making her particularly concerned about the hospital situation. "The Street Kings aren't just going after drugs," she reported. "They're threatening medical staff, trying to establish control over who gets treatment." Mike's jaw tightened. He'd seen similar tactics in war zones. Controlling medical care was a powerful way to control a population. "They're following a playbook," he observed, "but so are we. Sarah, I need you to expand those self-defense classes. Not just physical protection. We need to teach people how to recognize manipulation, how to resist coercion." The surveillance feeds showed Marcus's team engaging in a visible confrontation with the Street Kings at the hospital, making sure to be caught on security cameras. It was a convincing performance. Veterans protecting their community, seemingly reactive rather than strategic. "Rachel's team is in position," Chris reported quietly. "They've identified 3 new weapons caches in the warehouse district. Professional gear, military grade." Document everything, Mike ordered. We're not just fighting a street gang anymore. We're building a case against whoever's really behind this. Every piece of evidence matters. Through the monitors, they watched as the street kings withdrew from the hospital, apparently satisfied with their probing action. But Mike knew better. This was just the beginning. They'll escalate, Colonel Hayes predicted. These professionals they've brought in, they won't be satisfied with small-scale intimidation. Good, Mike replied, his tactical mind already several moves ahead. Let them escalate. Every time they do, they expose more of their operation, their real objectives. Meanwhile, we're building something they can't easily break. Emily Chen spoke up from where she'd been studying the surveillance feeds. The community's starting to notice. People are talking about how things feel different, safer. That's the real battle, Mike explained. Not just stopping their activities, but breaking their ability to rule through fear. Every person who stands up to them, every business that refuses to pay protection money, every kid who turns down their offers, that's how we win. The night deepened as more reports came in from teams positioned throughout Millbrook Heights. The street kings were probing defenses, testing responses, gathering intelligence. But so were the veterans, and they had decades of experience in this kind of warfare. "Remember Kandahar?" Jim asked quietly, standing near Mike's wheelchair. "The Taliban tried the same thing," Mike nodded. "Thought they could control the population through fear while probing our defenses. Made the same mistake these guys are making." "What's that?" "They think fear is a strength," Mike replied, watching the screens intently. "They don't understand that it's actually a weakness. Fear can be broken. Community, loyalty, brotherhood, those are harder to break." As if to emphasize his point, another group of veterans arrived at the command post, bringing news of more neighborhoods organizing, more citizens ready to stand up against the gangs. The street kings had wanted to rule through fear, but instead, they'd united the community against them. The real complexity of the situation was becoming clear. This wasn't just about street crime anymore. Someone with serious resources was trying to establish control over Millbrook Heights, using the street kings as their public face. But they hadn't counted on facing men and women who'd spent their lives fighting exactly this kind of battle. The night was far from over, and everyone knew the street kings would strike again. But this time, they wouldn't be facing scared citizens or overwhelmed police. They would be facing warriors who understood that the most important battles aren't always won with weapons, but with strategy, community, and unshakable determination. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to paint the sky when the street kings made their move. 3 convoys converged on downtown Millbrook Heights simultaneously, their timing too precise to be coincidental. Through Carter's fitness center's surveillance network, Mike Anderson watched the operation unfold with professional appreciation. "They've had training," he observed as the vehicles executed perfectly coordinated maneuvers. "These aren't street thugs playing soldier anymore." Colonel Hayes nodded grimly. "Their mercenary friends have been busy. That's standard private. Military contractor tactics, multiple simultaneous strikes to overwhelm response capabilities." The target of their operation became clear as the convoys split up, each heading toward different community gathering points. The first group approached Morning Star Coffee Shop, the second targeted the community center, and the third moved toward Carter's fitness center itself. "They're going after our support network," Mike analyzed, his tactical mind racing, "trying to show the community that we can't protect them." But the street kings and their professional backup were about to learn a harsh lesson about facing real operators. Mike keyed his radio, his voice calm and measured. "All units, execute Operation Checkmate." The response was immediate and devastating. As the first convoy approached Morning Star Coffee Shop, they found their path suddenly blocked by one of Kevin Mac McDonald's construction vehicles. a massive excavator that accidentally broke down right in the middle of the street. Before they could reverse course, Marcus Johnson's Rangers team emerged from pre-positioned locations, their movements precise and coordinated. "Target 1 contained," Marcus reported over the secure channel. The second convoy, heading for the community center, ran into an equally unexpected obstacle. Rachel Torres and her Force Recon team had prepared a masterful ambush, using nothing more than strategically parked civilian vehicles and the morning rush hour traffic to create a perfect trap. Just like old times, Rachel's voice crackled over the radio. "Target 2 is going nowhere." The third group, thinking they were being clever by approaching Carter's fitness center directly, found themselves caught in what military strategists call a kill box, though in this case, it was designed to capture rather than kill. Sam Martinez's team had transformed the entire block into a one-way route that led straight into a waiting police tactical unit. "You see?" Mike spoke quietly, watching the operation unfold. "The difference between thugs and warriors isn't just about training, it's about understanding the battlefield." Through the surveillance feeds, they could see Razor emerging from one of the vehicles, his face twisted with rage as he realized how completely they'd been outmaneuvered. The professional mercenaries with him looked equally stunned, their expensive, tactical gear and weapons useless against an enemy that had anticipated their every move. "Police units moving in," Chris Morgan reported from his communications station. "FBI tactical teams right behind them. Everything's being recorded from multiple angles." Mike allowed himself a small smile. When you're dealing with professionals, you have to give them a choice they can understand. Right now, those mercenaries are doing the math. They're realizing that whoever hired them isn't paying enough for this kind of opposition. True to his prediction, the mercenaries were already raising their hands, some of them actively distancing themselves from the Street Kings. They recognized a lost cause when they saw one. "This isn't over," Razor shouted as police officers approached his vehicle. "You think this is all we've got? You have no idea what's coming." "Actually," Mike replied, though Razor couldn't hear him, "we know exactly what's coming. That's why we're winning." Sarah Wilson entered the command center bringing reports from her early morning self-defense class. "The community's watching," she said, gesturing toward the growing crowds of onlookers. "They're seeing that the Street Kings aren't invincible. More importantly," Colonel Hayes added, "they're seeing that standing together works better than giving in to fear." The morning sun had fully risen now, illuminating a scene that would be talked about in Millbrook Heights for years to come. The Street Kings' attempt to demonstrate their power had instead become a demonstration of their vulnerability. But Mike knew this wasn't the end. Through the cameras, he could see the rage in Razor's eyes as he was led away in handcuffs. That kind of anger, combined with whatever resources were backing the gang, meant the real battle was still to come. "They'll try to bail them out," Sam Martinez predicted, watching the police processing their prisoners. "Their real backers won't want them talking to authorities." "I'm counting on it," Mike replied. "Every move they make tells us more about who they really are and what they're really after. This isn't about street crime. It never was. Someone wants control of Millbrook Heights badly enough to hire professionals. The question is why?" The veterans gathered around the command center began breaking down the morning's operation, analyzing what worked and what could be improved. They'd won this battle decisively, but experience had taught them that early victories could lead to complacency. "Chris," Mike called out, "show me the warehouse district." The screens shifted, revealing increased activity around the Street King's main base. More vehicles were arriving, expensive SUVs with tinted windows and corporate plates. "Looks like the real players are coming to clean up their mess," Colonel Hayes observed. Mike studied the new arrivals carefully. Their movements, their security procedures, even the way they parked their vehicles, spoke of serious corporate or government training. "Finally," he said softly. We get to see who's really pulling the strings. The morning's victory had been important, not just for the arrests made, but for what it revealed about their true opposition. The Street Kings were just pawns in a larger game, and now the real players were being forced to show themselves. As police continued processing the scene outside, Mike began coordinating the next phase of their operation. The veterans moved, with renewed purpose, understanding that they'd just graduated from fighting street thugs to confronting something much more dangerous. Remember, Mike addressed his teams, today wasn't about defeating the Street Kings. It was about forcing our real enemy to reveal themselves. Now, the real work begins. Through the windows of Carter's fitness center, they could see Millbrook Heights coming alive with morning activity. People walked the streets with more confidence. Businesses opened their doors without fear, and children waited for school buses without looking over their shoulders. They'd won something valuable today, not just a tactical victory, but a psychological one. The community had seen that organized crime could be beaten, that fear could be overcome. But Mike Anderson, who'd led men through countless battles, knew that the most dangerous part of any war came right after the first major victory. The real enemy was coming, and they wouldn't make the same mistakes the Street Kings had made. The battle for Millbrook Heights was about to enter a new phase, one that would require every bit of skill and experience these veterans possessed. But as Mike watched his team secure the area and gather intelligence, he felt the same calm confidence that had carried him through the world's most dangerous combat zones. They were ready for whatever came next, and this time, their enemy would learn what it truly meant to face warriors fighting for their home. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the parking lot of Carter's fitness center as expensive black SUVs pulled up outside. Men in tailored suits emerged, their movements betraying military training beneath their corporate exteriors. Through the surveillance feeds, Mike Anderson watched them approach. "Right on schedule," he murmured, recognizing the calculated timing of their arrival. Hours after the Street King's humiliation, but not so late that it would seem like a delayed response. "Blackwater Securities," Chris Morgan reported from his station, fingers flying across his keyboard. Or at least that's what they're calling themselves. Private security firm incorporated 6 months ago, but their digital footprint goes back about 6 minutes. Colonel Hayes studied the approaching men with practiced eyes. Shell company. Professional front for whoever's really running this operation. The suits entered the gym without knocking, their practiced smiles not quite reaching their eyes. Their leader, a tall man with silver hair and a bearing that screamed former intelligence operative, stepped forward. "Mr. Anderson," he said smoothly, "I'm Richard Blake, Chief Executive Officer of Blackwater Securities. We need to discuss this morning's unfortunate incident." Mike wheeled himself into a position that gave him clear sightlines to both exits while keeping Blake in front of him. Old habits died hard. Nothing unfortunate about it, just citizens protecting their community. Blake's smile tightened slightly. "Let's be frank. You've interfered with a legitimate business operation. My company has invested significant resources in Millbrook Heights development." "Development?" Mike's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Is that what you call using street gangs to terrorize a community, recruiting teenagers, running guns?" "You have a very limited perspective on the situation," Blake replied, maintaining his corporate demeanor. "We're implementing a comprehensive urban renewal project. The Street Kings were merely local contractors." The explanation might have sounded plausible in a boardroom, but to men who'd spent their lives fighting in the world's darkest places, it rang hollow. Mike had heard similar justifications from warlords and drug cartels, evil dressed up in business language. "Let me offer you a different perspective," Blake continued, pulling out a folder. "We're prepared to make you and your veteran friends a very generous offer. Your skills are impressive. We could use men like you in our organization." Mike didn't even glance at the folder. Not interested. You should be. Blake's voice hardened slightly. The alternative could be unpleasant for everyone. Before anyone could respond, Chris's voice cut through the tension. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south, heavy trucks, professional drivers, they're boxing in the neighborhood. Through the windows, they could see more black SUVs taking up positions around the area. Blake's corporate mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "Consider this a hostile takeover," he said quietly. "We tried to do this the easy way, using local talent. Now we'll do it our way. You have 1 hour to clear out of Millbrook Heights. After that, we can't guarantee anyone's safety." Mike's response was cut off by Sarah Wilson bursting into the command center, her face pale. They're at the hospital again. Armed men in suits saying they're implementing new security procedures. They're turning away patients. Blake smiled thinly. "As I said, comprehensive urban renewal. Control the infrastructure, control the community. Simple business strategy." "Simple terrorism," Mike corrected him, "just dressed up in corporate language." "Situation update," Chris reported urgently. "Similar teams at the power station, water treatment plant, and major intersections. They're implementing a lockdown." Colonel Hayes moved closer to Mike's position, his stance casual but ready. "Professional operators," he observed. "This isn't street gang level anymore." "No," Blake agreed. "This is what real power looks like. The street kings were amateurs. We are something else entirely." Mike studied Blake carefully, his tactical mind analyzing the situation. This was no longer about street crime or local gangs. This was about systematic control of an entire community, implemented by professionals who'd turned military tactics into corporate strategy. "You're right about one thing," Mike said finally. "This is something else entirely. But you've made 3 critical mistakes." Blake raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh? First, you assumed that because we beat the Street Kings, we showed our whole hand. We didn't. Second, you think corporate resources trump combat experience. They don't. And the third mistake?" Blake's amusement had an edge now. "You think we haven't been expecting this exact scenario since the moment we identified your shell company 3 weeks ago." Blake's smile froze as implications sank in. Before he could respond, Chris spoke up again. "Federal task force units moving into position, FBI, DEA, and Homeland Security. They've been waiting for probable cause to move on Blackwater Securities. Looks like corporate takeover of critical infrastructure qualifies." "Additionally," Mike continued, "every word of this conversation has been recorded and transmitted to multiple secure locations. Your corporate facade just crumbled on camera." Outside, the sound of helicopters filled the air. Blake's professional demeanor cracked completely as he realized how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he snarled, dropping all pretense of corporate civility. "We're not just some company. We have connections in places you can't imagine." "No," Mike replied calmly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. We're not just veterans. We're men who've spent our lives fighting people exactly like you. The only difference is, this time, we're fighting for our home." The sounds of federal agents securing the perimeter grew louder. Blake's men were already raising their hands, their corporate training no match for the overwhelming force surrounding them. "This isn't over," Blake promised as federal agents entered the gym. "You've just started a war you can't win." Mike watched as the man was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit somewhat less impressive now. "That's where you're wrong," he said quietly. "We didn't start this war. We just know how to finish it." But even as federal agents processed the scene, Mike knew Blake was partially right. This wasn't over. Blackwater Securities was just the visible face of something larger. Whoever was really behind this operation had resources, connections, and a reason for wanting control of Millbrook Heights. The afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting different shadows across the town. In neighborhoods throughout Millbrook Heights, people watched as men in suits were led away in handcuffs, their attempt at corporate terrorism thwarted before it could fully begin. The battle had just elevated to a new level. They were no longer fighting street thugs or even corporate mercenaries. They were facing an enemy that operated in boardrooms and backrooms, using shell companies and legal documents as weapons. But Mike Anderson had learned long ago that every enemy, no matter how sophisticated, had vulnerabilities. The key was finding them and exploiting them systematically. As he watched federal agents dismantling Blackwater Security's operation, he was already planning the next phase of their defense. The war for Millbrook Heights was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to show its true nature. But that was okay, because Mike and his team were just beginning to show theirs too. Night had fallen over Millbrook Heights when the first explosions rocked the town. Multiple detonations lit up the darkness, their timing too precise to be random. From his position in Carter's Fitness Center's command post, Mike Anderson watched the chaos unfold through surveillance feeds. 3 primary targets, Chris Morgan reported, his voice tight with urgency. Power substation, water treatment facility, and the main bridge. Professional demolition work. Through the windows, they could see sections of the town going dark. As the power grid failed, emergency sirens began wailing in the distance as first responders mobilized. They're not trying to destroy infrastructure, Mike analyzed, his combat experience reading the pattern. They're demonstrating control, showing they can shut down the town at will. Colonel Hayes nodded grimly. Whoever's behind Blackwater, Securities isn't giving up, they're escalating. The radio crackled with Sarah Wilson's voice from the hospital. Generators running, but we've got armed men trying to block access to the emergency room. They're wearing different uniforms, but it's the same tactical approach. New company, same players, Mike concluded. What's the name this time, Chris? Aegis Protection Services, Chris replied, pulling up documents on his screens. Incorporated yesterday, they move fast. The surveillance feeds showed more tactical teams deploying throughout Millbrook Heights. Unlike Blackwater Security's corporate approach, these operators made no attempt to hide their military nature. They moved with aggressive precision, securing key locations and setting up checkpoints. They're trying to create chaos, Mike observed, his wheelchair positioned to view multiple screens. Make the town feel helpless without their protection. Jim Carter entered the command center, his face streaked with sweat. They've got teams at every major intersection, telling people it's for emergency management during the infrastructure crisis they created. Mike's jaw tightened as he watched. More heavily armed men deploy across his town. This was no longer about subtle corporate takeovers. This was about brute force control. "Sir!" Chris called out suddenly. "Movement at the old warehouse district. Large convoy incoming." The screens showed a line of armored vehicles moving through the darkened streets. At their head was a black SUV that Mike recognized immediately. "Blake," he said quietly. "Guess federal custody didn't last long." "His connections must run deeper than we thought," Colonel Hayes commented, watching the convoy's progress. Mike wheeled himself to the center of the command post, his voice carrying the authority that had led men through countless battles. "This is it. The real players are finally showing themselves. Everything before was just testing our defenses." Through the cameras, they could see Richard Blake emerging from his vehicle at the warehouse. He'd traded his business suit for tactical gear, all pretense of corporate legitimacy abandoned. "Patch me through to him," Mike ordered. "I know he's monitoring our frequencies." Moments later, Blake's voice filled the command center. "Impressed with our response time, Mr. Anderson? You should be. What you're seeing is just a fraction of our capabilities." "I'm seeing desperate men making desperate moves," Mike replied calmly. You're showing your hand too early, Blake. Professional. Operators know better than that. Blake's laugh was cold. Professional operators! You still think this is about military tactics? This is about power, Mr. Anderson. Real power. The kind that comes from controlling every aspect of a community's life. As if to emphasize his point, another series of explosions illuminated the night sky. More sections of Millbrook Heights went dark. You can't hold a town hostage forever, Mike said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. We don't need forever, Blake replied, just long enough to implement our real plan. Millbrook Heights sits on something valuable. Mr. Anderson, something worth far more than this insignificant town. Mike's mind raced through possibilities, the urgent nature of their operation, the resources being deployed, the specific location of the town. The aquifer, he realized suddenly, the newly discovered aquifer that runs under Millbrook Heights. Very good. Blake's voice carried grudging respect. One of the largest freshwater reserves discovered in the last decade, worth billions to whoever controls it. The town was just an obstacle to be removed. Through the surveillance network, they could see more armored vehicles moving into position. Blake's forces were creating a perimeter around the warehouse district, establishing a forward operating base. You're going to force everyone out, Mike concluded. Create enough chaos and fear that people abandon their homes, then swoop in and claim the land through shell companies. A simplified version, but essentially correct, Blake confirmed. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. We have the resources, the manpower, and the political connections to make it happen. But Mike had spent his life fighting against seemingly insurmountable odds. He'd led men through situations where victory seemed impossible. And he'd learned that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who thought they couldn't lose. You're wrong, Blake, he replied, his voice carrying absolute conviction. Because you've just made the same mistake every overconfident operator makes. You've revealed your true objective. Through the windows, they could see more explosions illuminating the night sky. But Mike noticed something Blake hadn't. People weren't fleeing. Instead, neighbors were helping neighbors, setting up emergency supplies, organizing community responses. Look around you, Mike continued. You think chaos makes people run. Sometimes it makes them stand together. And when people stand together, no amount of force can move them. Blake's response was cut off by Chris's urgent voice. Multiple new contacts approaching the town. Large vehicles, military grade. Your reinforcements? Mike asked, though he already knew the answer. As I said, Blake replied smugly, this is about real power. By morning, Millbrook Heights will be under our complete control, and there's nothing you and your band of broken veterans can do about it. Mike allowed himself a small smile as he watched the situation unfold. Blake had revealed more than just his objective. He'd revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of what real power looked like. You know what your real mistake was, Blake? Mike asked quietly. You thought this was about control, but it's not. It's about community, and you just gave this community something more valuable than any aquifer. Oh, and what's that? A reason to fight back. The night had grown darker, but through the chaos and explosions, Mike could see lights appearing in windows throughout Millbrook Heights. Not emergency lights or police flashes, but ordinary house lights powered by generators and determination. Blake had tried to create fear and chaos. Instead, he'd created unity and purpose. The real crisis was about to begin, but Mike Anderson had learned long ago that the darkest moments often came just before the greatest victories. The war for Millbrook Heights had reached its critical point. But unlike Blake and his corporate warriors, Mike and his veterans weren't fighting for profit or power. They were fighting for home, and that made all the difference. The pre-dawn darkness over Millbrook Heights was shattered by the sound of gunfire. Through Carter's Fitness Center's surveillance network, Mike Anderson watched as Blake's forces engaged in what they thought was a decisive operation to take control of the town. "They're making their final push," Colonel Hayes observed, studying the tactical displays. Full-spectrum dominance, trying to control every aspect of the town simultaneously. Mike's wheelchair was positioned at the heart of their command center, his calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding on the screens. They still don't understand what they're really fighting. Armored vehicles moved through the streets with military precision, their crews executing what appeared to be a perfectly planned operation. Blake's forces had targeted every key infrastructure point, every strategic location, every potential center of resistance. Multiple teams converging on the hospital, Chris Morgan reported from his station. They're trying to cut off medical support. But what Blake's forces didn't know was that they were walking into a trap years in the making. Mike keyed his radio, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had led men through countless battles. "Execute Operation Hydra." The response was immediate and devastating. As Blake's teams approached the hospital, they found themselves caught in pre-sighted fields of fire. Rachel Torres and her force recon team had spent weeks preparing the hospital's defense, and now those preparations paid off. "Hospital team contained," Rachel reported calmly. "They're professional, but they're predictable, just like you said they'd be, Mike." Across town, similar scenes were playing out. Marcus Johnson's Rangers had transformed the power station into a fortress, while Sam Martinez's team had turned the water treatment plant into a defensive stronghold. "They're using standard military doctrine," Mike explained to the observers, "in the command center. The problem is we wrote that doctrine, and we know how to counter it." Through the surveillance feeds, they could see Blake's frustration mounting as his perfectly planned operation began to unravel. His forces were encountering resistance at every turn, their tactical advantages neutralized by veterans who'd spent decades perfecting the art of asymmetric warfare. "Sir," Chris called out urgently, "Blake's moving to his secondary plan. They're bringing in the heavy equipment." The screens showed massive drilling rigs being moved into position around the town. Blake's voice crackled over their monitored frequencies. "If we can't control the town, we'll take the aquifer by force. Start drilling operations immediately." Mike's response was immediate. "Kevin, execute Phase 2. Across Millbrook Heights, Kevin McDonald's construction crews sprang into action. But these weren't ordinary construction workers. They were combat engineers who'd spent weeks preparing for this exact scenario. "Pressure charges set," Kevin reported. "On your command." Mike watched as Blake's drilling teams positioned their equipment, completely unaware that the ground beneath them had been prepared for this moment. Now, controlled detonations rippled through the predetermined zones, not damaging the aquifer itself, but collapsing the access points Blake's teams were trying to establish. Years of demolitions experience had allowed Kevin's teams to protect the water source while denying it to the enemy. "Impossible!" Blake's voice carried genuine shock. "Those charges would have taken weeks to set up properly." "Months, actually," Mike replied calmly over the radio. "Did you really think we didn't know about the aquifer? That we hadn't been preparing for this since we first identified your shell companies?" But Blake wasn't finished. His forces began a coordinated assault on Carter's fitness center itself, clearly hoping to decapitate the resistance by taking out its command structure. "Let them come," Mike ordered as his veterans took up defensive positions. "Show them the difference between mercenaries and warriors." The battle that followed would be talked about in Millbrook Heights for years to come. Blake's professional operators were good, very good, but they were fighting for money. Mike's veterans were fighting for their home, and they'd transformed the entire town into an interlocking defensive position. Every approach to the fitness center had been prepared, every angle covered, every possible tactical advantage considered and countered. Blake's forces found themselves caught in a masterfully executed defense in depth. "This is your last chance, Blake," Mike broadcast as the battle reached its peak. "Your operation is compromised, your forces are contained, and federal response. Teams are inbound. Surrender while you can." Blake's answer came in the form of increased firepower, but his forces were already beginning to waver. Professional operators understood odds, and these odds were becoming increasingly unfavorable. "They're breaking," Colonel Hayes observed as Blake's teams began pulling back. "Their coordination's falling apart." Mike nodded, recognizing the signs of an unraveling operation. "They're realizing that all their tactical training doesn't matter when they're fighting men who helped write the books they learned from." Through the pre-dawn darkness, they could see Blake's forces retreating to their armored vehicles. But Mike wasn't done yet. "Sarah, execute community response." Across Millbrook Heights, lights began coming on in homes and businesses. People emerged onto their porches and streets, not running in fear, but standing in solidarity. The community Blake had tried to terrify into submission was instead showing its strength. "What are they doing?" Blake's voice carried confusion as his forces encountered civilians at every turn. Not attacking, just standing firm, recording everything on phones, bearing witness. "They're showing you what real power looks like," Mike replied. "Not force, not violence, but community, unity, the things you can't defeat with tactical teams and corporate resources." The sun was beginning to rise over Millbrook Heights, revealing the full extent of Blake's failure. His forces were surrounded, his operation exposed, and his strategic objective denied. But more importantly, he'd failed to understand the fundamental nature of what he was fighting against. "It's over, Blake," Mike broadcast one final time. "Your choice now is simple: surrender to us or wait for the federal response teams. Either way, your war for Millbrook Heights is finished." The sound of approaching helicopters filled the HU air, not Blake's reinforcements, but federal tactical teams responding to the situation. His remaining forces began laying down their weapons, professional pragmatism finally overriding corporate loyalty. As Blake himself was led away in handcuffs, for the second and final time, Mike wheeled himself to the fitness center's entrance. The morning sun illuminated a town that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. The battle for Millbrook Heights was over, but its impact would resonate far beyond this one community. It had shown that real strength didn't come from weapons, or resources, or tactical training. It came from people standing together, from veterans using their skills to protect rather than destroy, from a community that refused to be broken. Mike Anderson, the disabled veteran who had orchestrated this victory from his wheelchair, watched as his town began to rebuild. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, but he also knew that Millbrook Heights would face them the same way it had faced this threat, together. The morning after Blake's surrender dawned bright and clear over Millbrook Heights. City maintenance crews were already at work, restoring power and repairing damage from the night's conflict. At Carter's fitness center, Mike Anderson watched the recovery efforts through surveillance feeds that now showed healing instead of combat. "Federal teams have secured all of Blake's equipment," Chris Morgan reported from his station. "They're finding evidence of similar operations in other towns. Looks like Millbrook Heights wasn't their first target, just the first one that fought back successfully." Mike wheeled himself to the window, observing the changed atmosphere in the streets. People walked with newfound confidence. Neighbors helped each other clear debris, and the fear that had gripped the town just days ago had been replaced by something stronger: community pride. "Latest from the FBI," Sam Martinez announced, entering the command center with fresh intelligence. "Blake singing like a bird. Turns out his corporate backers weren't too loyal once things went south. He's naming names, revealing operations across 3 states." Colonel Hayes studied the preliminary reports with professional interest. Private military contractors, corrupt officials, corporate shell games. They had quite an operation going. until they ran into something they couldn't buy or intimidate. Sarah Wilson arrived from the hospital, bringing updates on the medical situation. All services restored, and something interesting is happening. People who were afraid to seek treatment when the Street Kings were controlling access are coming in now. We're uncovering months of untreated injuries and illnesses. That's how terror works, Mike observed quietly. It doesn't just hurt people physically, it makes them afraid to seek help. Breaking that fear is as important as breaking the people who caused it. Through the windows, they could see Kevin MacDonald's teams working with city engineers, not just repairing damage, but improving infrastructure. The battle had revealed weaknesses in the town's systems, and they were using this opportunity to build something better. Community response has been incredible, Jim Carter reported, reviewing messages from across town. People are organizing neighborhood watch groups, support networks, emergency response teams. They're not waiting for someone else to protect them anymore. Mike nodded, understanding the deeper significance. That's the real victory. Not just beating Blake's forces, but showing people they can stand up to anyone who tries to control them through fear. Rachel Torres entered with her Force Recon team, their professional demeanor softened by satisfaction. Street King's former territory is completely secured. Local kids who are being recruited by them are coming forward, wanting to help with the cleanup instead. The transformation was visible throughout Millbrook Heights. Former gang territories were being reclaimed by the community. Places that had been centers of fear were becoming gathering points for recovery efforts. The town wasn't just rebuilding, it was reinventing itself. Federal prosecutors want our documentation, Chris mentioned, gesturing to his extensive surveillance records. They're building cases against Blake's entire network. This could shut down similar operations across the country. Give them everything, Mike instructed. But keep copies. Someone else will try this again. Somewhere else. When they do, we'll be ready to help those communities fight back. Emily Chen arrived from her grocery store, which had become an impromptu community center during the crisis. People are asking how they can help, not just with cleanup, but with preventing something like this from happening again. That's the next phase, Mike explained, his tactical mind already focused on the future. We turn this momentum into something permanent. Training, organization, community defense that doesn't rely on outside help. Through the surveillance network, they could see former Street Kings territory transforming. Buildings that had been centers of criminal activity were being converted into community spaces. The warehouse district, once a base for Blake's operations, was being repurposed for legitimate businesses. Police report all Blake's mercenaries are in custody, Sam updated. Most of them are cooperating, hoping for lighter sentences. They're explaining how the operation was supposed to work, targeting vulnerable communities, using gangs as cover, then bringing in corporate muscle when needed. They had everything planned perfectly, Colonel Hayes observed, except for one thing. They didn't understand what they were really fighting, Mike finished. They thought it was about force, about control. They never realized it was about community, about people standing together. Sarah brought reports from her expanded self-defense classes, now evolved into comprehensive community defense training. We've got veterans volunteering to teach everything from basic security to emergency response. People want to learn how to protect themselves and their neighbors. The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating a town transformed not just physically but spiritually. The battle had shown Millbrook Heights something about itself, a strength that couldn't be broken by threats or violence. Blake's corporate backers are trying to distance themselves, Chris reported, monitoring financial news. Stock prices falling, executives resigning, investigations starting. They thought they could hide behind paperwork and shell companies. Evil always thinks it can hide, Mike replied, remembering lessons learned in combat zones across the world. Our job is to shine light in dark places, to show people they don't have to live in fear. Outside, more community members were gathering, bringing food, supplies, and offers of help. The crisis had revealed something powerful. When people stood together, no amount of corporate resources or tactical training could defeat them. We need to document everything, Mike instructed his team, not just for the prosecutors, but for other communities. What happened here isn't unique. Others will face similar threats. They need to know they can fight back. The veterans around him nodded, understanding the importance of passing on these lessons. They'd fought many battles in their lives, but this one was different. This wasn't about defeating an enemy. It was about building something stronger than any enemy could destroy. As the morning continued, Millbrook Heights buzzed with activity. But it wasn't the frightened energy of a town under siege. It was the purposeful movement of a community that had discovered its own strength, its own ability to stand against any threat. The immediate crisis was over, but Mike Anderson and his veterans knew their work was just beginning. They had shown what was possible when trained warriors used their skills to protect rather than destroy. Now they would build on that foundation, creating something that would last long after the memory of Blake and his mercenaries had faded. The sun rose fully over Millbrook Heights, illuminating not just a town that had survived, but one that had been transformed. The shadows that had haunted its streets were gone, replaced by the light of community, courage, and unshakable determination. 1 year later, Millbrook Heights had transformed into something no one could have predicted. The morning sun rose over a town that had not just survived its darkest hour, but had been reborn through it. Mike Anderson, now more active than ever, despite his wheelchair, sat in his usual spot at Morning Star Coffee Shop, watching the community he'd helped forge. Dave Miller approached with a fresh cup of coffee, his demeanor reflecting the town's transformation. The coffee shop, once a scene of confrontation, had become a symbol of community resilience. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Dave commented, setting down Mike's usual black coffee. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday." Through the window, they could see the positive changes that had swept through Millbrook Heights. The former Street King's territory had been completely revitalized. Where once stood abandoned buildings and drug houses, now community centers and local businesses thrived. "Some changes are more obvious than others," Mike observed, noting a group of teenagers helping an elderly neighbor with her groceries. These were the same kids who, a year ago, might have been gang recruits. Now they were part of the community youth program that Sarah Wilson had established. Carter's fitness center had evolved beyond a simple gym. Jim had transformed it into a comprehensive training facility where veterans taught everything from self-defense to emergency preparedness. More importantly, it remained a vigilant command center, ensuring that no threat like Blake's corporation could ever again gain a foothold in their town. "Got word from the FBI this morning," Chris Morgan reported, joining them with his tablet. "Final sentences came down for Blake and his corporate backers. They'll be away for a long time. More importantly, their entire network has been exposed. Similar operations in 3 other states have been shut down." Mike nodded, satisfied, but not complacent. "And the aquifer?" "Legally protected now," Sam Martinez answered, entering with fresh intelligence reports. "Community trust established to manage it. No corporation can touch it without going through the entire town's oversight board." The veteran watched as more morning activity filled the streets. Rachel Torres was leading a community defense class in the park, teaching residents the skills to protect themselves and their neighbors. Kevin Mack McDonald's construction company had become the town's largest employer, providing jobs to many former gang members who'd chosen a better path. "Morning patrol report," Marcus Johnson announced, joining the growing gathering. "The Rangers' regular security sweeps had become a welcome sight in Millbrook Heights. All quiet as usual, community watch programs are running smoothly in every neighborhood. Colonel Hayes arrived next, bringing news from the veteran network they'd established. 3 more towns have adopted our community defense model. They're sending people here to train next week. Mike allowed himself a small smile. What had started as a crisis response had evolved into something much more significant. Millbrook Heights had become a blueprint for other communities facing similar threats. Emily Chen's daughter just got accepted to police academy, Sarah Wilson reported proudly. The same girl who'd once been threatened by the Street Kings was now planning to protect her community legally. She says Mike inspired her. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting different shadows across a town that no longer feared them. Through the coffee shop window, Mike could see the daily life of Millbrook Heights unfolding. Not just normal, but better than normal. "You know what the real victory was?" he asked the gathered veterans. "Not beating Blake or the Street Kings, it was showing people that they don't have to live in fear, that when they stand together, nothing can break them." The evidence was everywhere. The hospital, once controlled by gang intimidation, now ran free community health programs. The schools had instituted veteran-led mentorship programs. Even the old warehouse district had been converted into a thriving business incubator, helping local entrepreneurs build legitimate enterprises. Latest community survey results, Chris shared, pulling up data on his tablet. Crime down 85% from last year. Community participation in local government up 200%. Small business applications at an all-time high. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't tell the whole story. The real change was in the spirit of Millbrook Heights. People walked the streets with confidence, not fear. Neighbors knew each other, looked out for each other. The town had found something that no corporate takeover could ever buy: genuine community strength. "We've had inquiries from 12 other towns this month," Colonel Hayes mentioned. "All facing similar situations, all wanting to know how we did it." Mike's response was immediate. "Share everything. The tactical plans, the training programs, the community organization strategies. What we built here isn't just for us." Through the window, they could see more signs of the town's transformation. The community center was hosting another self-defense class. The youth program was organizing a neighborhood cleanup. Former gang members worked alongside business owners, contributing to the community they'd once terrorized. "You know what Blake never understood?" Mike asked, watching the town he'd helped transform. He thought power came from control, from fear. But real power comes from people standing together, from community, from turning neighbors into allies. Sarah Wilson arrived with news from her expanded programs. The Community Health Initiative is going national. Other towns are using our model to break the cycle of medical intimidation. We're literally saving lives beyond our borders. Mike nodded, satisfied but aware that their work was never truly finished. That's the real legacy of what happened here. Not just protecting one town, but showing others they can protect themselves. The morning continued to unfold, each moment revealing another aspect of Millbrook Heights' transformation. The town hadn't just survived, it had become a beacon of hope, a model for communities facing similar threats. As Mike watched his town embrace another peaceful day, he remembered the words he'd spoken to Blake during their final confrontation. Real strength wasn't about weapons or resources or tactical advantages. It was about people standing together, about community, about turning fear into determination. The war for Millbrook Heights had ended a year ago, but its impact continued to ripple outward, touching other communities, inspiring other transformations. The disabled veteran who had led his town through its darkest hour had helped create something that would outlast any threat. A community that stood together, unafraid and unbreakable. Up next, You've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.